Have you ever wondered why no matter how fast you run, happiness always seems just a few steps ahead? We chase money, hoping it will bring us peace. We chase relationships, thinking love will finally make us feel whole. We chase success, craving the validation it promises. But here's the question no one wants to ask. What if the very act of chasing is the reason we never feel fulfilled? From the moment we wake up, we're pulled into the race. We check our phones. We check the time. We check how far behind we are, not just in work, but in life itself. There's always something to do, somewhere to be, someone else to become. It's as if life has become a constant audition. For worthiness, for love, for a sense of being enough. But in this endless pursuit, something quietly slips away, ourselves. We lose touch with the breath. We forget the warmth of the sunlight through the window. We no longer see the sacredness of the ordinary, and yet, if we could pause, just for a moment, we might hear a gentle whisper deep within. You were never meant to chase life. You were meant to live it. This isn't just poetic, it's a truth echoed in the heart of Buddhist teachings. The Buddha didn't teach us to chase after happiness. He showed us how to stop running and discover that happiness has been quietly waiting here, now, all along. So the real question is not how do I get more? But rather, what am I running from? And what might happen if I simply stopped? Because maybe, just maybe, when you stop chasing, you finally start living. Let us take this journey together, not to run faster, but to walk slower, to see deeper, to live fuller. Let me tell you a story. There once was a young man who grew up in a small village. Every day, he would look at the distant city skyline and whisper to himself, "One day, I'll go there. One day, I'll make it big." That's where real life begins. So he worked hard, studied late into the night, and eventually, he made it. The job, the car, the apartment with a view. He had everything he once dreamed of, but something felt missing. The silence in his apartment was louder than the noise of the city. He scrolled endlessly through social media, comparing himself to others who seemed just a little happier, a little richer, a little more fulfilled. He had chased the dream, but the dream kept shifting. Sound familiar? This is the trap of tanha, the craving the Buddha spoke of in the second noble truth, a thirst that can never be quenched. No matter how much we drink from the cup of achievement, the cup refills with new desires, more, better, faster. We believe, if I just get this one thing, I'll finally be happy. But the moment we do, the mind moves the finish line. It's like chasing the horizon. You can run your entire life and never reach it. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha said, craving is the root of suffering. Not because wanting something is evil, but because we tie our happiness to things that are impermanent. We believe the next promotion will bring peace. The next relationship will heal our loneliness. The next version of ourselves will finally be worthy. But the reality, everything we chase is constantly changing, and when we attach our happiness to things that change, our happiness becomes just as fragile. You see, the illusion isn't just in what we chase, it's in the belief that fulfillment lies somewhere else. We don't chase because we lack things. We chase because we lack presence. Right now, in this very moment, you are already breathing, your heart is beating, life is here, vibrant, mysterious, sacred, but the chasing mind doesn't see that, it sees only what's missing. This is the root of restlessness. It's the reason why even billionaires feel empty, why influencers with millions of followers still cry themselves to sleep. Why the perfect life online often hides a deep hunger inside. The illusion is strong, but it begins to weaken when we become still. When we truly understand that nothing out there will ever complete us, we begin the real journey, inward. So I invite you to pause, and ask yourself not, what do I still need to get? But rather, what am I not seeing in what I already have? Because when we see clearly, the chase begins to lose its power, and that's when we begin to touch something sacred, the miracle of the present moment. Do you remember the last time you truly felt alive, not just functioning, not just surviving, but really present? Perhaps it was a quiet morning when you watched the sunrise, or the way the wind moved gently through the trees, or maybe, it was a moment of deep laughter with someone you loved, a moment where time disappeared, and you were just there, no plans, no pressure, no chase. That, my friend, was real life. But here's the tragedy: most of us live everywhere except where life is happening. Our minds are stuck in a past we cannot change, or running toward a future we cannot control. We're always on the way to somewhere else, but never quite here, and yet this moment, this breath, this very second, is the only place where life actually exists. As Thich Nhat Hanh beautifully said, the present moment is filled with joy and happiness. If you are attentive, you will see it. But most people don't see it, because we've been conditioned to overlook it, to treat now as just a stepping stone to something better. We sit at dinner, but scroll our phones. We walk through nature, but replay arguments in our minds. We say I love you, but are already thinking of tomorrow's to-do list. This is what the Buddha called mindlessness. A state of being physically alive, but spiritually asleep. He taught that true freedom is not found by rearranging external conditions, but by waking up to what's already here. Be where you are, otherwise you will miss your life. Buddha, so how do we return? How do we unlock the door to real life? The door we've walked past 1,000 times without noticing. The key is mindfulness, not just a technique, not a trendy app, but a way of being. Mindfulness means coming home to the present moment with full awareness. It's looking at your cup of tea and actually seeing it, not just drinking while thinking of emails. It's listening to your child's laughter without mentally composing your next meeting agenda. It's being fully here. Body, mind, and heart, united in one place. And here's the miracle: when we become present, ordinary things become sacred. A simple breath feels like a gift. Washing the dishes becomes a meditation. Even silence has music in it. This doesn't mean we stop planning or stop working. But now, we do it from a place of awareness, not craving. We become participants in life, not prisoners of time. In the Zen tradition, a monk once asked his teacher, "Master, what is the path to enlightenment?" The master replied, "When hungry, eat. When tired, sleep." The monk was confused. "But isn't that what everyone does?" The master smiled, "No. When people eat, their minds are elsewhere. When they sleep, their minds are full of dreams. That is why they are not truly living." So let me ask you, are you truly living, or are you just racing through life, one checkbox at a time? If you can learn to return to this moment, again and again, you will begin to experience what the Buddha called the taste of liberation. Not in the distant future, not after achieving more, but right here, right now, in the miracle of the present breath. So pause, feel your feet on the floor, feel the breath entering your lungs. This is life. There was once a man who carried a heavy bag of stones on his back. Everywhere he went, to work, to sleep, even in his dreams, the bag was with him. People would ask him, "Why don't you put it down?" And he would say, "Because I've carried it for so long. I don't know who I am without it." That man is many of us. We carry things that no longer serve us: regrets, anger, jealousy, broken dreams, old identities. Like stones on our back, we tell ourselves, "I'll be free once I fix this. Once they say sorry. Once I prove I'm enough." But here's the truth: you don't need to carry all of it to be worthy. You don't need to fix the past to be at peace in the present. Letting go doesn't mean we forget. It means we stop allowing the past to poison the present. In Buddhist philosophy, clinging is one of the greatest causes of suffering. We cling to stories: "I should have done better. They shouldn't have hurt me. This is not how life was supposed to go." But as long as we clutch these narratives, we can never open our hands to what life is offering now. Let go or be dragged. Zen proverb, think about that. So many of us are being dragged by memories, identities, unmet expectations. We hold tightly, and we suffer quietly. The Buddha once taught through a simple parable: a man is shot with a poisoned arrow. Instead of removing it, he demands to know who shot it, what kind of bow was used, what tribe the archer came from. While he obsesses over the details, he dies. This is us, obsessing over who wronged us, why life didn't go our way, why we didn't get what we wanted. And in doing so, we miss the chance to heal. To let go is not weakness, it's courage. It's the bravery to release what is beyond your control, so you can hold what is still possible. Letting go might mean forgiving someone who never said sorry, releasing an identity you built to feel loved, surrendering the idea that your worth depends on success. But here's the paradox: you don't lose yourself when you let go, you find your true self, like a tree in autumn, letting go of its leaves, not because it's dying, but because it's making space for new life. We, too, must learn the seasons of our soul. When you let go of resentment, your heart becomes lighter. When you let go of perfectionism, your creativity returns. When you let go of needing to be right, you rediscover peace. As Ajahn Chah said, if you let go a little, you will have a little peace. If you let go a lot, you will have a lot of peace. If you let go completely, you will have complete peace. So let me ask you, what are you still holding, that is holding you back? Can you gently, lovingly, begin to loosen your grip? It won't happen all at once. Letting go is not a one-time event, it's a daily practice, a quiet decision to stop feeding the stories of suffering. And each time you release a little more, you come home to your own heart, lighter, freer, more real. And now that your hands are no longer full, you're ready to receive something deeper. Meaning, purpose, presence. Imagine this: two lotus flowers grow in the same pond, one blooms early, wide and bright, the other takes more time, slower to open, quieter in color. Does the pond judge? Does the sun shine more on one than the other? No, they both grow in their own time, in their own way, and both are beautiful. But we, as human beings, we compare, constantly, unconsciously, endlessly. Why is their life better? Why am I not as successful? Why can't I be more like them? We scroll through lives that aren't ours, and wonder why we don't feel enough. But here's the truth no one tells you: comparison is a thief. It steals joy, it steals peace, it steals the very miracle of being you. We live in a world addicted to measurement. How many followers, how much money, how fast we've achieved something, and yet, none of those numbers touch the soul. The Buddha taught, do not compare yourself with others. If you do so, you are insulting yourself. Why? Because comparison denies your sacred uniqueness. Your dharma, your path, is unlike any other. You are not here to live someone else's life. Imagine if the moon envied the sun, or if a bamboo tree compared itself to an oak. What madness! And yet, that is exactly what we do. Every day, we look outside ourselves for validation. We chase someone else's dream, thinking it will fill our emptiness. But what if the problem isn't that you're not enough? What if the problem is that you've forgotten how to be you? There's a story of a monk who traveled to many monasteries, asking every teacher the same question: Master, how do I find my true self? Most gave long answers, but one day, an old teacher simply smiled and said, stop looking at others. Start seeing what's already inside you. That was the turning point. In Buddhist psychology, one of the root causes of suffering is craving, and comparison is craving's silent twin. It tells you, you will be happy when you become someone else. But true peace is not becoming someone else, it's being fully present with who you already are. So how do we break this habit? It begins with awareness. Catch the moment your mind says, they're ahead of me, and gently whisper back, there is no race. Instead of comparing, practice compassion for yourself. Instead of envy, try reverence for others. And instead of chasing someone else's highlight reel, tend to your own roots, your inner garden, your own quiet blooming. Remember, a flower does not bloom by looking at others, it blooms by facing the light. You, as much as anyone in the universe, deserve your love and affection. Buddha, so start being, not becoming, not impressing, not performing, just being still, being kind, being enough. You were not born to be a copy, you were born to be a presence, and in that presence, you'll discover a joy that no achievement can give, a joy that comparison can never touch. Now that we've reclaimed our inner space and begun to honor who we are, it's time to explore how to truly live without needing to chase anything. Imagine being on a road trip with no destination in mind. You're not in a rush, there's no ticking clock, no to-do list looming over you. The open road is simply there. You drive, not to get somewhere, but because you enjoy the ride. Every turn, every pause, an invitation to experience life as it comes. In that moment, you're free. Now, think about your life. How much of it feels like that free road trip, or how much of it feels like an endless chase? We live in a world that teaches us to chase success, chase love, chase approval, chase happiness. It's as if we're constantly racing, but never quite arriving. The more we chase, the further it feels like we're slipping away from the present moment. The future beckons, the past haunts, and we run, until one day, we wonder, what have I really been chasing? In Buddhism, the act of chasing is rooted in the illusion of attachment. We chase after things because we believe they will bring us happiness, safety, validation. We think that once we have that perfect relationship, that perfect job, that perfect body, we will finally be enough. But the Buddha taught something radical. Happiness is not something you find by chasing it. Happiness is something you experience when you stop chasing. When you are here, fully present, with no agenda. When you stop grasping at life and simply allow it to unfold. But how do we stop chasing? First, it begins with awareness. The next time you feel that rush, the desire to do more, to get ahead, to be more, pause, take a breath, and ask yourself, why am I chasing this? Is it because you believe you're incomplete? Is it because you're seeking approval from the world? Or is it because you're afraid of being left behind? This awareness is the key, and in that pause, you begin to let go. Instead of running after what you think you need, you become present with what you already have. You savor the moment, rather than reaching for the next. The Buddha's teachings on non-attachment reveal that attachment isn't just about physical possessions, it's about our grasping for control. When we chase, we grasp, and when we grasp, we suffer. Letting go of this grasping, this chasing, is the freedom we seek. The beauty of non-chasing is that it does not mean inaction, it means a shift in intention. You act, but not from a place of needing or wanting. You act because you are fully alive in the moment, because life is flowing through you, not because you are running after something. Imagine a river flowing effortlessly towards the ocean. It doesn't strain, it doesn't fight, it simply moves. It's a perfect metaphor for the art of non-chasing. You flow with life, not against it. So, how do we live this freedom? The next time you feel that familiar urge to chase, remind yourself, I don't need to catch anything. I am the river, not the shore. Let go of the belief that you need more to be more. Let go of the fear that life will pass you by if you don't act faster. Instead, give yourself permission to simply be. In doing so, you'll find that life starts coming to you, instead of you always running after it. The right opportunities, relationships, and experiences, they'll find you. Because when you stop chasing, you open yourself to what is already there. The freedom of non-chasing is not about resignation, it's about liberation. You stop chasing because you no longer feel the need to prove anything. You stop chasing because you found enough in yourself. And as you stop running, you find a life that is richer, deeper, and more meaningful. As we arrive at the end of this journey, I want you to pause for a moment. Close your eyes, take a deep breath. What do you feel? Perhaps, you're noticing something you've been missing all along, the present moment. You see, all along, the key to true freedom, the answer to the chase we've been running, has been right here. It's not in the next big achievement, it's not in the next relationship, the next house, or the next promotion. True peace doesn't come from constantly striving, from looking ahead to what's next. It comes from looking right where you are, from embracing now. When we stop chasing, we stop living in the future, we stop running after the next goal, the next dream, the next more. And we begin to embrace the magic of being. The truth is, the world is not waiting for you to become someone else, it's waiting for you to become you. Every moment you spend chasing something outside of yourself, you miss the beauty that's already here, the joy, the peace, the love. So stop chasing. Instead, embrace where you are, embrace who you are, embrace the small moments that make up the whole of your life. It's not about becoming something you're not, it's about being everything you already are. When we stop chasing, we free ourselves from the trap of comparison, we free ourselves from the need to prove anything. We simply are. This is the art of true freedom, and it is the gift of non-chasing. As we close this chapter, I invite you to reflect on these words: the more you let go, the more you can receive. Thich Nhat Hanh. If you felt a shift today, if something in your heart is waking up, I encourage you to take a moment and subscribe to this channel, Zen Buddhism Wisdom, where we explore more of these teachings together. Like, comment, and share this video if it resonated with you, and let's start a conversation in the comments below. How have you felt about this journey of non-chasing? What does it mean for you to embrace the present moment? Remember, life is already unfolding perfectly, and you are a vital part of it. Thank you for being here with me today, and I look forward to the next chapter of our journey together. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and click the bell to get notifications for future videos from Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Let's continue exploring the depth of Buddhist teachings and how they can transform our everyday lives. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your reflections and insights.